Right, hello, Jeremy Corbyn, Labour. I think it's fair to say it's been a very smooth ride since Jeremy Corbyn became leader on September the 12th. Very calm, nuanced political debate has ensued in this country. It has been a chaotic few weeks, and that's because Jeremy Corbyn, he didn't expect to become Labour leader. He only put himself forward to have a debate and put policies on the agenda. So it wasn't like there was years of preparation that went into it. To have, not have that huge preparation and then to end up leader of a parliamentary party that doesn't really want you there at all, and to have a very aggressive media, well, all of that is a recipe for chaos. So what I'm going to do is come up with my suggestions about what the Labour leadership should do, given everything that's happening at the moment. Before I carry on, though, I want to get something very, very clear, because whenever I make suggestions, I always get this response from certain largely right-wing publications, which is, you see, Owen Jones is angling for a job in Jeremy Corbyn's office, or indeed that I desperately wanted one in the first place. I'm even on camera in this very YouTube channel saying that exact same thing.
Would you take a job in Jeremy Corbyn's office?
No. And to be honest, I'd be rubbish at it. Number one, the whole patriotism issue. Now, what those who defend the status quo and injustice always want to do is to paint those who believe in a more socially just country as almost as people who hate their own country, who are unpatriotic. There's nothing more patriotic than wanting to rid your country of injustice. I'm not suggesting Jeremy Corbyn or anybody else needs to start wrapping themselves in the Union Jack. If they're allowed to be portrayed as somehow unpatriotic or not loving the country which they wish to represent and serve, then it will be the likes of UKIP and the Conservatives who will benefit. So it's something that just has to be knocked on the head. Number two, you can't win by just going on about people at the bottom of society, people who are most in poverty and hardship. You've got to have things to say for people who are in the middle. I'm a socialist, which means I want a society run in the interest of the majority rather than a tiny group of people at the top. That doesn't mean trying to win sympathy for the bottom 10 or 15%. That's not my idea of socialism. That's a kind of quite a Victorian paternalistic view of things. In the next few years, it's predicted that the number of self-employed people will eclipse the number of public sector workers. But self-employed people have all sorts of issues that need to be addressed. The fact they can't often get loans from banks, the fact they have often no paid sick leave or paid maternity leave or other basic social security. I'll give you another example, housing. We've got to deal with the fact that about 5 million Britons are on social housing waiting lists, and the fact that for about 11 million private renters, me included, often there are rip-off rents that many people find very difficult to afford. There's no question that most people do aspire to owning their own home, and people can't just ignore that or stick their fingers in their ears and pretend that's not the case, because it is. Why not, for example, abolish stamp duty, which is a bad tax, to be honest, and replace both that and council tax, which also hits middle income as well as low income people. It's not a progressive tax, and replace it with a land value tax, which would mean richer people would contribute more. It'd be fairer to middle income and low income people. And also by getting rid of stamp duty, you'd open up home ownership to people at the moment who might not be able to afford it. 250,000 fewer people own their own homes since David Cameron became Prime Minister. Number three, older people. Now, I've got the figures here for the last general election in 2015 in May, and it's quite incredible this. The Tories only had a lead over Labour for those over the age of 44. 18 to 24-year-olds, 43% voted Labour and 27% only voted for the Conservatives. The problem is less than half of them turn out to vote. With over 65s, 47% of them voted for the Conservatives. And yet the difference there is there was a turnout of nearly 80%. Now, obviously, there has to be policies that inspire young people to come out and vote. And where do you even end with the plight of young people, whether it be being punished with debt for aspiring to education, the lack of secure, well-paid jobs, the lack of affordable housing, youth services being cut. I mean, we really could go on forever. So obviously those policies have to be there, but Labour has to really emphasise what it has to offer older people. For example, the crisis of adult social care, which is only getting worse under this government, and the need to have detailed proposals to deal with it. There's still a massive issue with pensioner poverty, which is higher than it is in many other comparable large countries. There's another idea which is a bit controversial, but I think is worth investigating. I've actually ripped it off from the Green Party's policies, apologies to the Green Party, but that is to abolish inheritance tax and replace it with a new tax that taxes not the estate of the person who's died, but actually taxes on the basis of how much the recipient has. So that's, you know, it stops it being branded as a death tax, because it's about your wealth rather than the wealth of the person who dies. Again, I think that's something very much worth investigating. 4, economic credibility. Absolutely critical. And what I think has been very welcome with John McDonnell as Shadow Chancellor is he's got together a council of economic experts, and these are impressive names, you know, Nobel Prize winners like Joseph Stiglitz, obviously the economist Thomas Piketty. One of the pitfalls of Labour's message could be that it's anti-austerity. Now, austerity is a word that's quite meaningless to most people. During the election campaign, one of the most Googled phrases during the leaders' debates was, "What is austerity?" After 5 years of it. It shouldn't be a case of what Labour opposes, but about what it supports. What sort of society, what sort of economy does it want to build? You know, the high-tech jobs of the future, the renewable energy sector of the future to take on the environmental and the jobs crisis as well, to have a new economy which isn't focused just on finance in the southeast, but both to change the nature of that financial sector, but also to rebuild secure jobs in areas across the country which have really got hammered by the collapse of traditional industries. 5, national security. What happened in Paris the other week was a monstrous, despicable crime committed by a bunch of fanatical losers. And, you know, that is a real threat. I don't actually overblow it because that's what they want. But there is a current and real threat, and it's a threat to human lives. Now, you know, there is this fanatical group, ISIS, and they are a real danger, particularly in the Middle East, but also to Britain, France and other countries. So the Labour leadership has to emphasise that it understands the gravity of that threat. Now, clearly that means disagreeing, often forcefully, with the Conservative strategy, because the Conservatives are in bed with the Saudi dictatorship and other dictatorships in the Middle East, who, particularly Saudi Arabia, which is at the absolute epicentre of international extremism. In terms of dealing with ISIS, obviously there'll be this debate about airstrikes and the nature of those airstrikes, but there are, at the moment, forces fighting on the ground, not least the Kurds. Now, we should be supporting the Kurds fully, and that means maybe demanding, for example, huge increases in military supplies to them. They should be armed to the teeth, the Kurds, and dealing with the role of Turkey, our NATO ally, which is allowing ISIS fighters to just cross the border and is attacking Kurdish freedom fighters who are targeting ISIS. I think what's welcome about what Labour said now is they're saying we need to reverse police cuts and we need extra resources for the intelligence services. That's a wise political thing to do. 6, immigration. This is a subject the left often just wants to go away. They just don't want to deal with it. But the truth is, and this is a difficult truth often for the left to recognise, is that immigration regularly tops the polls for the subject voters care most about. Now, I think one I've suggested before is a so-called immigration dividend, that communities with high levels of immigration should get extra financial support. And that's because the studies show that immigrants pay in more than they get back. So that extra money that's coming in should go to the areas with a higher level of immigration. I think there needs to be a huge emphasis on dealing with undercutting of terms and conditions and wages by employers, whether that be by immigrants or by agency workers who are based here in Britain. What UKIP and the lot want us to do is to just call anybody racist who questions immigration, and all that does is drive people further into their arms. So there has to be a far more empathetic approach, but it can't just be won by saying immigration is brilliant, sticking our fingers in our ears and hoping things will change, because I don't think they will. Now, these are just a few initial ideas. I could go on forever, but I think we all got things to do. I'm not going to bore you all completely to death. What has to hang it all together is message discipline, because the Conservatives What they do with their messages is they say them over and over and over again until people like me are pulling our hair out. And that's what Labour has to do. They have to speak to the aspirations and fears of the majority of people in society and to come up with an inspiring alternative that people feel is credible and coherent. So that's what I think. I want to hear what you think. Keep your comments coming. Subscribe to the channel. I'll see you next time.